The steam rising from the pot of feijoada reminded me of mornings in my grandmother's kitchen in Rio. Even after 5 years in Boston, that scent still had the power to transport me home in an instant. I inhaled deeply, letting the familiar aroma of black beans, pork, and bay leaves fill my lungs before the breakfast rush began. "Raphael, the delivery guy is here with the produce," Camila called from the front of the restaurant. I wiped my hands on my apron and headed to the delivery entrance of Raízes, meaning roots in Portuguese, my small Brazilian-inspired restaurant tucked between a vintage bookstore and a coffee shop in Boston's South End. Not the most glamorous location, but the rent was what I could afford when I opened 18 months ago. "Morning, Joe," I said, signing for the delivery. "Any good strawberries today?" "Got you the best ones, chef. Local farm. Just like you asked." I inspected the produce. Vibrant greens, ripe tomatoes, and strawberries that actually smelled like strawberries, not the plastic imitations from the big suppliers. This was why my food costs were higher than they should be, why my margins were razor thin, and why I struggled to make rent some months. But it was also why people who tried my food came back. Back in the kitchen, I checked the reservations for the day. 20 covers for lunch, 35 for dinner. Not terrible for a Tuesday, but not enough to dig us out of the financial hole that seemed to deepen each month. The latest utility bill sat on my desk, stamped with a red final notice that I'd been avoiding like a bad review. "You look worried," said Elena, my sous chef, as she diced onions with practiced efficiency. Her hands never stopped moving, even as she watched me with concern. "Is it the bills again?" I forced a smile. "Nothing we haven't handled before." "That's what you said last month, and the month before that," she replied, scraping the onions into a bowl. "Raphael, at some point, passion doesn't pay the rent." Elena wasn't wrong. Since moving from Brazil to the US for culinary school, I'd been chasing a dream that seemed to drift further away with each passing day. I wanted to show Americans that Brazilian cuisine wasn't just churrasco and caipirinhas. It was the complex flavors of maquica, the comfort of cochinha, the soul-satisfying simplicity of pão de queijo. I wanted to honor my grandmother's recipes while bringing them into conversation with contemporary techniques. Critics loved us. Food bloggers raved about our authenticity with a twist. But rave reviews didn't translate to a sustainable business in a city where dining trends changed faster than New England weather. Meanwhile, the restaurant chains and celebrity chef outposts around us packed in tourists and kept their lights on without breaking a sweat. "We've been invited to the New England Food Innovation Showcase next week," I said, changing the subject. "I submitted our application months ago and forgot about it." Elena's eyes widened. "That's huge, Raphael. All the major investors and restaurant groups attend that event." "Exactly," I nodded, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. If we impress the right people, we might find someone willing to invest in Raízes without requiring us to compromise what makes us special. "You mean someone who won't want to turn us into a frozen pão de queijo factory?" Elena laughed. "Precisely," I replied, though in my darkest moments, I'd wondered if selling out might be the only way to survive. The day passed in the controlled chaos that defined restaurant life. I personally plated every dish, ensuring each component told the story I wanted to tell. The story of my grandmother's kitchen, of Brazilian hospitality, of food that was made with respect for ingredients and tradition. When guests asked to meet the chef, I emerged from the kitchen, tired but proud, sharing brief stories about the origins of their meals. That evening, after the final customers left and the cleaning was done, I sat alone at the bar with my laptop, reviewing the numbers again. The truth glared back at me from the spreadsheet. At our current rate, Raízes had maybe 3 months before I'd have to close the doors. I closed my eyes, the weight of potential failure pressing down on my chest. I thought about the day I'd signed the lease, How my hands had trembled with excitement and fear as I'd scrawled my signature across the papers. I thought about my parents back in Brazil, who'd mortgaged their small home to help fund my dream, and how I'd promised to make them proud. I thought about Lawrence Wilson, the restaurant mogul whose corporate food empire I'd interned at during culinary school. How he'd laughed when I shared my vision for Raices. "Cute idea, kid," he'd said, not looking up from his phone. "But nobody gets rich selling food with integrity. It's all about volume and margins in this business." His words had fueled me then. Now, they returned as a haunting reminder of what I was up against. I closed my laptop and pulled out my notebook instead. The New England Food Innovation Showcase was 1 week away. If this was my last shot, I needed to make it count. I began to sketch a menu that would showcase everything Raices stood for. Dishes that honored my roots while demonstrating my technical skill and creativity. As I worked, I felt a familiar sensation stirring within me. That stubborn determination that had carried me from my grandmother's kitchen in Rio to culinary school in America, from being an immigrant dishwasher to opening my own restaurant. It was the same fire that had kept me going every time someone had told me I couldn't succeed on my own terms. Outside, the Boston night grew quiet. Inside, I planned my next move in a game where the odds were stacked against me. But if there's one thing Brazilians know, it's how to find joy and possibility when the circumstances suggest there is none. The showcase would either be Raices' salvation or its swan song. Either way, I would enter that event as I had entered every challenge in my life. With my head high, my grandfather's knife in my roll, and my grandmother's recipes in my heart. What I didn't know then was that the event would also reunite me with Lawrence Wilson, under circumstances neither of us could have predicted, and that the conversation that followed would change both our lives forever. The week before the New England Food Innovation Showcase passed in a blur of preparation. Every spare moment was dedicated to perfecting the 3 dishes I would present. Modern interpretations of Brazilian classics that told my story without a single unnecessary word. "You need to sleep sometime," Elena said, finding me at 3 a.m. hunched over a pot of reduced acai sauce that would accompany my reimagined makika. "I'll sleep when we're either saved or bankrupt," I replied with a tired smile. The truth was I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the disappointed faces of my staff if I had to tell them Raices was closing. I saw my parents trying to hide their concern during our weekly video calls. Most of all, I saw my grandmother, who had taught me that food made without love wasn't worth eating. The morning of the showcase arrived with cruel perfection. Bright sunshine, crisp autumn air, the kind of day that suggested everything was possible. We loaded my carefully prepared ingredients into Elena's beat-up Honda and headed to the convention center downtown. "Remember," Elena said as we pulled into the parking garage, "regardless of what happens today, what you've built matters." I nodded, grateful for her support, but too focused to fully absorb her words. Today wasn't about validation. It was about survival. The exhibition hall was already buzzing when we arrived. White-clothed tables stretched across the vast space, each showcasing the vision of a different chef or food entrepreneur. Corporate sponsors had elaborate booths with professional signage and uniformed staff. By comparison, our table, decorated with a simple cloth in the colors of the Brazilian flag and handwritten cards describing each dish, looked almost childlike in its modesty. I was arranging my prep station when a familiar voice cut through the ambient noise. "Still playing Restaurant Raphael?" Lawrence Wilson stood before me, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent. He was flanked by 2 assistants and a photographer, clearly there in an official capacity. "Mr. Wilson," I managed, wiping my hands on my apron. "I didn't know you were involved with the showcase." He flashed a smile that never reached his eyes. "Wilson Restaurant Group is the primary sponsor this year. We're always looking for new concepts to improve." He emphasized the last word in a way that made it clear what he thought needed improving. "Though I must say, I'm surprised to see you still in business. Most passion projects fold within a year." We're celebrating our 18th month next week, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Hanging on by a thread, I imagine, he said, glancing dismissively at my modest setup. This industry devours sentimentality, Raphael. I told you that years ago. Before I could respond, he was distracted by one of his assistants pointing out something across the room. Well, good luck today. Perhaps you'll find someone willing to invest in whatever this is. With a vague wave toward my table, he moved on to speak with a chef from a trendy molecular gastronomy restaurant nearby. My face burned with a mixture of anger and humiliation. Lawrence Wilson had dismissed me years ago when I was just a culinary student with big dreams. Now, when I most needed confidence, he'd done it again. Who was that jerk? Elena whispered, appearing beside me with our cooler of final ingredients. Lawrence Wilson, restaurant mogul, over 40 establishments across the country, all serving perfectly acceptable, completely forgettable food at premium prices, I explained. I interned for his company during culinary school, and clearly made a lasting impression, she observed dryly. Not the kind I wanted to make, I admitted. The showcase officially opened at noon, and soon our table was surrounded by curious attendees sampling my offerings. A deconstructed feijoada that concentrated the traditional flavors into elegant, approachable bites. A seafood makika transformed into a delicate composition of local fish, vibrant peppers, and coconut foam. And for dessert, a reimagined brigadeiro presented as a warm chocolate sphere that melted to reveal passion fruit cream. A symbol of Brazil's heart hiding beneath a modest exterior. The responses were enthusiastic. Food writers took detailed notes, local chefs exchanged cards with me, and several attendees returned for second tastings. By mid-afternoon, I was beginning to feel a cautious optimism. Then came the announcement that Lawrence Wilson would be giving the keynote address in the main auditorium. Most of the showcase participants and attendees filed in to hear him speak. Elena urged me to go. Know your enemy, she said with a wink. I slipped into the back of the auditorium as Wilson took the stage to enthusiastic applause. He spoke confidently about market trends, scaling strategies, and the science of restaurant profitability. His presentation was slick, filled with graphs showing the growth of his restaurant empire and testimonials from franchise owners who had become wealthy under his system. The restaurant business isn't about food, he declared. It's about replicable systems and consumer psychology. Anyone telling you different is selling a fantasy. I felt the hope that had been building throughout the day begin to deflate. In Wilson's world, the world that dominated the industry, my entire approach was fundamentally flawed. When the keynote ended and the crowd returned to the exhibition floor, there was a noticeable shift in energy. Investors and industry representatives who had shown interest in my table earlier now gravitated toward concepts that more clearly aligned with Wilson's vision of scalability and mass appeal. I continued serving, explaining my dishes and philosophy to whoever would listen, but I could feel the opportunity slipping away. As the afternoon wore on, I caught occasional glimpses of Wilson moving through the hall with an entourage, stopping at certain tables, making notes, completely bypassing others, including mine. Then, during a rare quiet moment, he appeared again at my station, this time with a small group of men and women in business attire. They didn't approach as potential customers, but stood several feet away, observing my setup with analytical detachment. "This is what I was telling you about," Wilson said loudly enough for me to hear. "The passionate ethnic food concept. These places pop up constantly. Brazilian this month, Filipino next month. They get good reviews from food bloggers looking for authenticity, but they can't sustain. No systems, no scalability, just emotion." He practically sneered the last word. One of the women in his group glanced at me sympathetically, clearly aware I could hear every word. "So what makes a restaurant successful in your view, Mr. Wilson?" she asked, perhaps trying to steer the conversation away from direct criticism. Wilson seized the opportunity to hold court. Success requires accepting reality, not clinging to romantic notions about food. It's about giving people what they think they want while maximizing your profit margin. It's about building an operation that runs with or without you. He turned directly toward me. It's certainly not about serving dishes your grandmother made while going bankrupt in the process. The group fell silent, the woman looking mortified. Several nearby exhibitors and attendees had stopped to witness the encounter. I felt dozens of eyes on me, waiting for my response. In that moment, I had a choice. I could shrink away from this public humiliation, or I could stand my ground. I thought about my restaurant, my staff, my grandmother. I thought about all the customers who had told me my food made them feel something: joy, nostalgia, connection. I stepped out from behind my table and approached Wilson and his group. "Mr. Wilson," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "I appreciate your business perspective, but I believe we simply define success differently." Wilson raised an eyebrow, clearly not accustomed to being challenged. "Oh, and how would you define it, Chef Raphael?" "Because from where I stand, success is measured in profit and growth, not in warm feelings and good reviews that don't pay the bills. Success, to me, means creating food that honors where I come from while building community where I am now. It means treating my staff with dignity and my ingredients with respect. It means making a living doing something meaningful." I paused, aware that more people had gathered around us. Maybe that won't make me rich. Maybe Raises won't last forever. But I'd rather fail on my own terms than succeed on terms I can't respect. Wilson's expression hardened. "That's precisely why you'll never be truly successful, Raphael. This touching idealism might make for a nice story, but the market doesn't reward sentiment. It rewards pragmatism." He gestured around the hall. "Look at all these concepts. The ones that will survive are the ones willing to adapt to what sells, not what feels authentic. In 5 years, most of these precious independent restaurants will be gone, and my group will still be opening 3 new locations per quarter." His words hit like physical blows because they voiced my deepest fears. But I refused to let him see that. "Perhaps you're right, Mr. Wilson," I said quietly. "But if the cost of your kind of success is leaving behind everything I value, then I'll take my chances with failure." I returned to my station without waiting for his response, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. Elena squeezed my arm in silent support. The crowd slowly dispersed, conversations resuming in hushed tones. Wilson and his group moved on without another word, but the damage was done. For the remainder of the showcase, I continued serving my food with as much pride and passion as I could muster, but inside I felt hollowed out. Not just because of Wilson's public dismissal, but because I feared he might be right. As we packed up our supplies at the end of the day, several people stopped by to express admiration for how I had handled the confrontation. A food writer promised a feature in her blog. A local chef invited me to collaborate on a special dinner. Small victories that would normally have thrilled me, but now felt insufficient against the looming reality of my financial situation. "You stood up to the big bad wolf," Elena said as we loaded the last of our equipment into her car. "That took courage." "Courage doesn't pay the electric bill," I replied, trying to smile but feeling the weight of impending defeat. Maybe I should have swallowed my pride and asked him for a job. Elena shook her head. "That's not who you are." "No," I agreed, watching the convention center recede in the side mirror as we pulled away. "But sometimes I wonder if who I am is compatible with survival in this business." I didn't know then that the public confrontation with Lawrence Wilson would spread through Boston's food community like wildfire. I didn't know that the humiliation I felt that day would eventually transform into something else entirely. And I certainly didn't know that in just 6 months, I would be standing at Lawrence Wilson's door under circumstances neither of us could have imagined. What I did know was that tomorrow, I would open Raises again. I would cook with the same care and attention I always had. And I would keep fighting for my vision of success, even if the odds suggested it was already a lost cause. Because that's what my grandmother would have done. 6 months passed like a fever dream. That day at the showcase changed everything, just not how I expected. The video of my confrontation with Lawrence Wilson went viral in food circles. Suddenly, Raises wasn't just a struggling Brazilian restaurant. It became a symbol of culinary integrity. Reservations doubled, then tripled. Food journalists who'd overlooked us became regular visitors. I used this unexpected spotlight, not just to save my restaurant, but to build something more. We started free cooking classes for immigrant kids. We implemented a pay-what-you-can program on Mondays for families facing hard times. The restaurant became a community hub, where food wasn't just consumed but celebrated, shared, taught. Meanwhile, Wilson's empire was crumbling. A major food safety scandal hit 3 of his flagship restaurants. Then financial irregularities surfaced. The man who preached systems over soul had apparently cut corners on both. Within months, the Wilson Restaurant Group filed for bankruptcy. I was in the kitchen prepping for dinner service when Elena burst through the door. "Raphael, you need to see who's waiting outside." Standing on the sidewalk, looking nothing like the imposing figure I remembered, was Lawrence Wilson. Gone was the tailored suit, replaced by casual clothes that still looked expensive but somehow diminished. His confident posture had given way to the slight stoop of a man carrying invisible weight. "Mr. Wilson," I said, stepping outside. "This is unexpected." He looked at me with eyes that had lost their arrogance. "I thought about calling first, but I figured you'd refuse to see me." "What can I do for you?" I asked, genuinely curious. "I'd like to talk about the future." He glanced at the restaurant windows, where curious staff were trying to appear busy while watching us. "Your future, and possibly mine. I have prep to finish before we open," I said. "But you're welcome to come in and talk while I work." He followed me into my kitchen, a space so different from the industrial operations he'd built his fortune on. Here, there were no standardized stations or laminated process sheets, just people who loved food, making it with care. As I continued preparing the night special, Wilson watched in silence before finally speaking. "I was wrong about you, Raphael. About all of this." He gestured around the kitchen. "I thought success could only look one way. I built an empire on efficiency and profit margins, and now it's gone. Meanwhile, you built a community." I kept slicing plantains, letting him continue. "I've been approached about writing a book on rebuilding after business failure," he said with a hollow laugh. "Ironic, isn't it? The mighty Lawrence Wilson, seeking redemption. What does this have to do with me?" I asked, though I suspected I knew. "I'm proposing a partnership." His voice regained some of its former confidence. "Not for me to take over your restaurant, but for you to help me build something new. Something with both sound business practices and the soul I now realize is essential." I set down my knife and looked at him directly. "6 months ago, you told me I'd never be truly successful because I refused to compromise my values for profit. Do you remember what I said in response?" He nodded slowly. "That you'd rather fail on your own terms than succeed on terms you couldn't respect. And here we are," I said quietly. "I didn't fail, not because I was lucky, but because my definition of success was always more sustainable than yours. People don't just want food, they want meaning, connection, authenticity." Wilson's expression shifted from humility to something like hope. "That's exactly why I'm here. I have the business experience. You have the heart. Together we could create restaurants that make a difference," I finished for him. "That treat employees with dignity, source ingredients responsibly, and contribute to their communities." For the first time in our acquaintance, Lawrence Wilson was speechless. He hadn't expected acceptance, certainly not this quickly. "Why would you even consider working with me after how I treated you?" he finally asked. I thought about my grandmother, about the values she'd instilled in me, about how she'd taught me that true wealth wasn't what you accumulated, but what you shared. "Because success isn't just about proving someone wrong," I said, returning to my prep. "It's about creating something right." 3 years later, our partnership has launched 5 restaurants across New England, each one profitable, each one woven into its community. Wilson has changed, not completely, but meaningfully. I've changed too, learning that sometimes principles work better when paired with pragmatism. The rich man who once told me I'd never be truly successful now starts each management meeting by asking, "How are we measuring success this week?" It's never just about the numbers. And that, perhaps, is the greatest success of all.